Welcome back everyone, and we're going to have a look at part 6 in this video, which is all about variable and temporary tables. We're going to have a look at what those are and how we can use those in our code. So let's head on it to SQL Server Management Studio. Here we go then. Let's change our database there. Now, the first one we're going to look at is the temporary table. Now, temporary table is defined with the little hash in front of the name there. So the name of our temporary table, we're going to call it sales, and it's denoted by the hash there, as you can see. Now, it's always a good idea to check if something exists before you try and create a table or other object, and we can simply do this by dropping it, drop table if exists, and then we put the name of our temporary table there. This just means that if this temporary table already exists, we're going to drop it so that when we recreate it further down in the code, we don't have an issue where it says that this table already exists. So then, temporary tables, what are those all about? Well, a temporary table can be created in order to store data. It's kind of like a CTE in a way, common table expression, where you're creating a table on the fly. Now, the great thing about temporary tables is that they remain stored and ready to use throughout your entire query, and that is, if you put one hash, it becomes a local temporary table, which means within this query you can run a select statement against this temporary table as many times as you need to, until of course you drop the table. So how do we go about creating this temporary table? Well, it's really quite simple. Here's a basic select statement. All you need to do at the end of your select portion there is type the word into, and then you simply name your temporary table right there. And then you continue with the rest of your select statement with your froms, inner joins, etc., etc. So all this is going to do is it's going to create this set of data and simply put it into the temporary table there. So let's have a go at that. Let's run it off, and you can see the amount of rows that have been pushed into that temporary table. Now that's sitting there ready for us to extract from, so all we need to do is simply select start from that temporary table, and there you have it. There's our select statement. Now we can select from it as many times as we want, and we can keep on going. So that's how to just simply create a temporary table. Very easy, using the into and then naming the table. Of course, if we try to run this off again, as you can see, there's already an object. However, if we now drop it, then it will redo it, or drop the temporary table, and it'll redo back into that. So for example, if you change one of these columns, or you did something within the code, simply just drop it, and then you can redo your select statement and push the data into that temporary table. Now this is only a local temporary table, so if we put in a new query, for example, we took this here and we tried to run it here, it says, where's this object? It doesn't exist. So it only selects from your local temporary table within this individual query window right here. So that's one thing to remember with that one. We can also, if we want to, actually create the table and then we push the data into it. The reason you'd create the table before doing the very simple into clause here is if you want to make sure of the data types. So for example, extended price is as a decimal, but we actually want it to be a float. And then quantity, you've got an int there, we actually want it to be a big int. So both of those data types, int and big int, and float and decimal, are very similar. So we know that we could push a decimal into a column which has a float data type, and an int will go into big int. We're quite confident that that'll happen, no problem. So what we're going to do is specify the exact data types that we want. Of course, we need to drop the table first before we can create it, and we can simply run off these bits of code here. So we'll create the table and then we'll insert into our temporary table. Whoa. What we need to do is insert into block that out. So because we've already created the table, we can't then create it into our into there, so we simply insert the data into it. There you go, and when we select from it, we've got our data there. Fantastic stuff. So that's pretty straight and easy. Two ways that you can do your temporary table. One is to simply into and then your temporary table there. Another way is to actually create the table first and then you do the insert into and then you write your select statement as we've just seen there. Now you've also got a global temporary table, as you can see with the next line. We've got two hashes at the beginning, so that defines it as a global variable. So let's see what happens when we push it into there. We get the same amount of rows into our global temporary table. So if we select from it now, as you can see, it's all good. Now, the benefit of that is that if we go to a new query window and execute, we can now see our data because it's a global variable as opposed to stored locally within this one single query window. So we can open up as many query windows as we want, and we can then use this global variable. Now if we close all these query windows down, this global variable won't disappear, so what we need to do is drop it if we want to completely remove it from the database. But we can use it in different queries as we go. Execute that and it's dropped. So we've got the local temporary table and we've got the global temporary table. Myself, I've never really used the global type, but I've used the local one very regularly, especially inside some complex stored procedures. And that is pretty much temporary tables for you. Quite useful when you're doing a lot of testing, when you're checking data, etc. Because once you've run off your query to put data into your temporary table, you can keep selecting from it. It doesn't disappear after you've executed the whole query just the once. Moving on then to the table variable. Slightly different, very similar in effect, but the way it works is a little bit different. So what you need to do is you need to declare your variable as opposed to creating your table. You need to declare your variable, and you put the @ sign in front, very similar to the parameters that you saw that we were passing into stored procedures and functions. Then you name your variable, I'm going to call it sales, and you'd write the term table at the end. If you didn't put in table, it would then create this as a normal scalar variable where you output one result and one result only. But we're creating it as a table, so this is the way you start the declaration there. And as you can see, it's laid out exactly like a normal table there, where you specify your columns, you've got your data types, not null, etc., etc. Very similar to what we did up here. But you have to declare your variable first. Unlike here, where you don't have to declare the temporary table, you can just pass the data into it. Here, you actually have to declare it and put in all the columns. Now, one slight difference between the table variable and the temporary table is that the table variable tends to store the table in memory, so it's pretty quick. The temporary table, however, tends to store it in disk, and that's why you can carry on selecting it. Now, what we do once we declare the table variable, we then insert into it. Again, very similar to what we did on the temporary table, and we select our data, and that will go into our temporary table we've just set up there. And then we can, of course, select from it. So let's give that a go, and we're going to execute that, and there you have it. There's the data, pretty much exactly the same as what we had on the temporary table. Now, one thing to note is that you have to do everything you want in one run, because if I now try to select from that variable, you can see that it's disappeared. So you can't continue to select from it. You could with your temporary table, but your table variable, you can't select from it. So even if I try to insert now, that variable has pretty much disappeared. So you pretty much got to do it in one full sweep. So even if I ran off these two here, it worked fine, it inserted those rows, that's pretty much all it did. If I tried to select, then of course it's gone. Now you can also set up a global variable, putting your two @s, very similar to your global temporary table. However, once again, I don't tend to use this, as once the variable's been declared, how exactly to use it in a new window, not too sure. These sort of global variables tend to be used by the system on very specific system managed variables that you can then select from when doing specific work. So when would you use the two? Well, I'll tend to use a table variable if you are creating a very small data set, a few columns, a few thousand rows, etc., etc., and then you're going to use those straight away. But normally I will go for the temporary table, because you can then keep selecting from it from there. So that's the difference between the two, temporary table and table variable, and how they're used. So let's see them in action then. What we're going to do is to put together a multi-statement stored procedure for you. We're going to start off, as we have, with the stored procedure that we learnt in part 3, and we're going to create this stored procedure here. we're going to pass in the year, the tax percentage, and the customer ID. You can see I put a few defaults there. However, you don't need to do that. The customer ID, we haven't got a default there. Right then, so I'm going to use the good old temporary table there. So I'm going to make sure it doesn't exist before I create it within my select statement. So drop table if exists, etc., etc. Then I'm going to select the customer ID, customer name, put that into the temporary table there, from the table sales customers, and I'm going to make sure that the customer ID is the parameter that gets passed in there. So all I'm doing first is creating a temporary table of all the customers, where of the customer ID and the name, where the ID is what's being passed into the store procedure. And that's simply it. Very simply, very basic, and that goes into my little customer table. And then further down in my main select statement, where I'm ordering I'm returning quite a few columns here. Of course, we've got our function in there using our tax percentage that we're passing in as well as a parameter, and we've got a filter in here where we're passing in the year. And here you can see on the inner join, instead of joining it to the customer table, what I'm doing is joining it to this temporary table here. Letting us see on customer ID equals customer ID. So exactly the same as if we were using the sales customer table from our database here that you've seen me use on many occasions. Instead, I'm just going to be using it from this temporary table here, just to show you how easy it is to use those temporary tables within your joins. So let's create that store procedure quickly. Fantastic, it's up and running. Now let's give it an execute. And of course we have to pass in the year, the top, tax percentage, and customer ID. Now you make sure we've got them in the right order. Year, tax percentage, customer ID 1. Let's execute that. There you go. There's our customer ID of 1, and we've got all our data for just that one customer. Based 10% tax amount as well, and the year of the invoice date is 2015. So now we can continue executing our stored procedure and putting in very different parameters. And because we're dropping the table there for creating it, if we did amend the stored procedure, if we had to add in other columns, etc., and we didn't alter proc, it won't give us the issue that this already exists. So let's run that off, and you can see we've got customer ID of 2 there, invoice date 2014, tax amount of 15%. So very useful tools to use within your store procedures. When you start to build up some more complex store procedures, you can use these temporary tables and the table variables inside your query there, and then pass the results onto another select statement. So you are kind of building a table on the fly. Brilliant. That is your example there of a multi-statement store procedure. Pretty straightforward stuff, pretty easy to use to bring your temporary table or your table variable, you'd use it in the same way, within your inner join into your final select statement to get your results. Alrighty then, we've got a scenario for you to look at, In this scenario, the purchasing manager is looking to save her team some time at the start of the month when they are busy preparing reports from data that they manually extract off the purchasing system. Plus, she is not 100% convinced that the data that they give to her is all that accurate. Fair enough. So, she's asked you to cook up some SQL magic to sort her out. She's after the following columns. There's quite a few columns there. However, she wants to be able to select the supplier category ID and the purchase order year to filter the data by. So I'm thinking parameters into a stored procedure. You've decided to write a multi-statement stored procedure, there you go, that she can access and run off when she needs to. So then, once we've done that, we need to test our code, make sure it works before sending the information to her. Okay, if you fancy giving that a try, look at the example here. If you need something to refer to, give that stored procedure a go and pause the video. When you're ready, when you've done your own SQL magic, we'll go through the answer from my side. Now remember, you might do things different to myself, and it doesn't matter, just as long as the results are the same in the end. Okay then, let's crack on with my answer. What I'm going to do first, before I even create the procedure, we've got supplier category ID and we've got supplier information there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build that query up first of all and put it in a temporary table. Let's go for it from, and of course supplier name, that's on the purchasing side. Let's get the suppliers in. Supplier name, there we go, and we've got the suppliers category. And we know from working with the schema before, we know exactly where to get that information. Brilliant stuff. Supplier category ID. Supplier category ID. Fantastic stuff. Supplier category name. Okay, so we've got these two columns here in our very first statement. It's working fine. So then what we need to do is push that into a temporary table, or you could have used one of these, a table variable. I'm sure you figured out by now which one I prefer. I'm going to call it SUP, supplier for short there, and of course I'm going to make sure, just to make sure I don't have any errors when I run the code and it says the table already exists, I'm going to drop it and then make sure it goes into that. Right then, and remember, she's after the supplier category ID, so there's going to be a variable passed into this here. I'm going to put it in against the supplier category here. You could of course do it on suppliers because you've got supplier category in both tables, so it doesn't matter which one you put it in. You could put it in the where clause in the and there because we're in adjoining, so it's not a problem which one you do. I'm going to call that subcat. Brilliant, so we've got our variable in there. Let's now build our stored procedure. Now you can say create proc, you can say create procedure, up to you how you want to do that. Let's put it in the purchasing schema. How about that? Change for you there. And we're just going to call it subcat for short. Excellent stuff. Pretty simple. And let's bring in our parameters. Now that's an integer. If you hover over here, you can see it says integer. So we're going to keep it the same. And we've got a second one here, the purchase order year. And that's more likely going to be an integer as well. And lastly, as, and we're going to put begin as well. Now you don't necessarily have to put begin and end, but I like to make sure it's pretty much transactional. Begin there, all this code is 1, and then you end with that. Okay, so we've now done our first bit where we select the supplier name and category based on the supplier category there, and we then need to build the rest of our query, which is these 5 columns here. So we're looking at purchase orders, and we've got the orders and the order lines there. So let's build up our final query. Bring up purchase orders, and we'll more likely be joining onto the order lines with our outers and our received items and the item description. Purchase order ID equals O. Purchase order ID. Fantastic stuff. What do we need then? Item, the purchase order ID and date. So we'll get that from the orders table. Getting really used to this database now. Really quick. Finding those columns we need. And then we need these 3: item description, ordered outers and received outers, all from our order lines. Is there a description in here somewhere? Fantastic, there we have it. Ordered outers, and last but not least, we have our received outers. Now we're also going to be bringing in the data from this table here, and we know that we are filtering it by the supplier category ID, so we're going to use an inner join as opposed to a left join, because we want all of these orders information to be just from this selection here. Dot supplier name. Now we can't join supplier name or supplier category to any of these 2 tables. Let's have a look at purchase orders. Well, we can join on the supplier ID, so we need to bring that in as well. Supplier ID, fantastic stuff. Let's grab that there, equals O dot, double click that, copy, paste, supplier ID. Fantastic. So we've built up our query there. Any more filters? Yep, we need to bring in the year, which is the purchase order year. Our order date here. equals, and we've got our, yeah, there we go. It's clever enough. When you start typing it out, it'll give you the option to put it in your query. So we've built up our two queries. We also want to pass in the supplier ID, the supply name, and the category name, not forgetting those. And of course, we need to change that as S because they're coming from that table there. Brilliant stuff. So we've got all the columns, she's after, supplier name, etc., etc. And we have done our filtering as well, our parameterization, in order for the purchasing manager to put in the values that she's after. Easy stuff. Let's close off that little query there. Let's end that, and we can put in go. How's it looking? Good. We've got a bit of a squiggle there. Must be the only statement in the batch. Let's have a look up here. As begin. Where's it getting confused? Probably because we haven't put a little go there. Now it's all good. Fantastic. Right, let's create this. See if it works. Brilliant stuff. And now we'll try executing it. You can type exec, you can type execute. And then let's put in some parameters. Supplier category of 2, for example. And we'll go 2016. I think 2016 is the only year. We'll soon find out. So we've got our procedure. Let's see what happens there. And there you have it. We're getting results. That's fantastic. So our order date is 2016 there. There's only 10 rows. And we've got our supplier name. Let's change that a bit. Let's see if anything on 2015. Nothing on there. So I think it all came from 2016. No, we haven't got a supplier category of 3. We can see how many supplier categories we've got. We've got quite a few in there. So what we can do is keep trying until we get more hits. And there you go. There's your supplier name, different one from before, and that's 708 rows. So we know that our stored procedure is working just fine. So how did you go with that one? Again, doesn't matter what your code looks like, probably very similar to mine though, whether you used a temporary table or a table variable, entirely up to you in this scenario. So that's it, everyone, for your temporary tables and your table variables. 2 ways of achieving the same result, some slight differences, and you've also got your local versus your global temporary tables and table variables. Brilliant stuff. That is it for part 6, and it's also the end of episode 6. We've covered quite a bit there, got some really useful code, so join me in episode 7 where we start to have more fun and games with SQL coding. Everyone, I wish you all a fantastic day until we meet again in the next video.